how to fund the department in 2015. But its size has not protected the Bureau from pressures on staff and facilities. The federal prison population has grown tremendously, over 800% from 1980 until 2011, while the number of facilities tripled in that time. This growth, after 4 decades of relatively stable population, has not been accompanied by an increase in staff and space. The Bureau now has to manage a vast national logistical network. It is overcrowded, faces daunting security tests, and rising food and medical costs. Last year was a tough year. BOP survived in part because the Justice Department, with approval, I might say, with this committee that pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, transferred hundreds of millions of dollars to BOP to prevent furloughs and sustain operations. The system was at risk, and we had to pay the bill, and that was at the expense of other Justice Department efforts and programs. Enactment of a full FY14 spending bill provides some relief, but the disruption was a strong illustration of sequestration consequences. For FY15, you requested $6.96 billion in new budget authority, 0.5% above FY14, but this is actually a cut. For the $193 million in base increases are offset by $158 million in unspecified administrative reductions. This budgetary sleight of hand is difficult to understand in this instance, since BOP has significant growing base operating costs. We will probe further into the impact of these budget assumptions. A development that may benefit BOP and reduce costs stems from the bipartisan movement to reform our nation's complex correctional systems with renewed focus on reentry, integration into society, and a reduction of recidivism. BOP's new Reentry Services Division was created to rationalize sentencing and explore justice reinvestment initiatives. We want to hear today how such approaches can mitigate or offset the inflow of new prison and safety challenges. BOP staff has had to cope with chronic overcrowding, made more serious by the violent profile of medium and high security inmates, many of whom are in gangs. Last year we shared your grief for 2 BOP officers who were killed while on duty. Dedicated men and women of BOP know the risks they face, and I think those risks are growing much more today than they've ever been, and I think that will continue to be the case. But our job is to keep them as safe as possible, so we want to hear progress in that area. Your budget proposes no significant new construction. There's annualization of the cost of existing sites. We want to learn the status of the current projects. Finally, I'm pleased to note the progress by the Federal Prison Industries and Unicor and its commercial representative in promoting FBI services and manufacturing capability not only to other federal agencies, but to other government and private customers. They're taking steps to repatriate manufacturing jobs that were going overseas. FBI has an important mission to train and help prepare inmates for a successful transition into society, and a growing FBI business is a good way to achieve the outcome for more federal prisoners, and also helps with regard to the deficit. Before you testify, let me recognize my colleague, Mr. Fatal, for his comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first state that, as best as we know at the moment, this is the last hearing of the CJS subcommittee prior to our markup, and could be the last subcommittee hearing in all likelihood for our chairman. And I want to just say that after some 34 years of service in the House and as the leader of this committee, he's done an extraordinary job and has accommodated the witnesses and the committee's workload in a way in which we could do our oversight and understand how we can proceed. Has always been extraordinarily cognizant of making sure that the minority has ample input in the committee's work. So I want to thank him. I want to welcome you again before the committee. It is true, as the chairman said, that for some 40 years this population was very stable and under 30,000, well under 30,000, and now at 216,000 inmates. And you have a number of factors, obviously that has led to this explosive growth, but it is a challenge, and it's eating away at the the budget of DOJ, in terms of the other work that has to be done in terms of national security and the like. So, you have, done some work in looking at, the dual responsibilities of the Bureau of Prisons, which is both in and reentry. And you have to have a dual competence. There's some 45,000 inmates from the federal prison system that will each year reenter communities throughout this country. And the question is, are those communities safer upon their time with you, or are they those communities more endangered based on these inmates' time with you? And it has to do with whether or not we're smart about this. So as we take away services inside the prison, whether educational or job training or conflict and anger management or drug treatment, then that just means that these 45,000 a year inmates who reenter our communities are less able to cope in a civilized society, and they may revisit one of your facilities, but only after victimizing other people on the way. So it costs our society, and we're very interested in the work that you're doing. Look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vitale, and I appreciate your comments. We've had a good over the years, and so I'm very, very grateful. Pursuant to the authority granted in Section 191 of Title II of the United States Code and Clause 2M2 of House Rule 11, today's witnesses will be sworn in before testifying. Please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
I'll let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you very much. Just one. Do you want to proceed? Okay. Mr. Rogers, the full committee chairman, is coming. I know he has a lot of interest, so at that time we can pause and let him make a statement, but why don't you proceed as appropriate?
Good morning, Chairman Wolf, Ranking Member Fatah. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the President's 2015 budget request for the Bureau of Prisons. Through the support of this committee and the American people, the Bureau continues to be a leader in corrections. Investments in our workforce and operations have been critical to maintaining safe and secure prisons. Our staff are dedicated public servants who work diligently 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, weekends and holidays, to provide care and programs that give inmates the best chance for a successful return to their communities. Our mission is to protect society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prisons and community-based facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and appropriately secure, and that provide work and other self-improvement opportunities to assist offenders in becoming law-abiding citizens. I firmly stand behind our mission, and so do the other 39,000 dedicated men and women who successfully carry out our mission each and every day. As you know, the Bureau suffered tragic losses in 2013 with the members of Officer Eric Williams and Lieutenant Osvaldo Albarrate. These losses underscore the many challenges the staff face daily. We're grateful for additional authorities this subcommittee provided to expand federal prison industries, programming such as repatriation, and we are enthusiastically pursuing many different products and working with many potential partners. Currently, there are inmates involved in repatriation projects. In the last 6 months, the number of inmates participating in these projects has more than doubled. FPI's Board of Directors has approved 34 categories of repatriation projects. Chairman Wolf, the President's budget request for 2015 is $6.8 billion for the BOP's salaries and expenses account and $90 million for the buildings and facilities account. These funding levels will allow the Bureau to fulfill its mission. The requested resources will allow us to continue the activation of recently constructed and acquired facilities, funding provided in the 2014 budget to continue the reentry programs and maintain staffing at the 2014 level. The Bureau is the nation's largest correction system with responsibility for over 216,000 inmates. We confine almost 174,000 inmates in 119 federal prisons that have a total rated capacity of nearly 132,000 beds. The remaining 42,000 inmates are in privately operated prisons, in residential reentry centers, local jails, or in home confinement. System-wide, the Bureau is operating at 32% capacity. Crowding is of special concern at our higher security facilities, with 53% crowding at our high security institutions and 43% at our medium security prisons. The safety of staff, inmates, and the public are our highest priorities. We have undertaken several recent changes to our operations to enhance safety and security. In May 2012, the Bureau began an evaluation to assess the effectiveness of pepper spray for use in emergency situations at several high security prisons. Last year, we decided to expand the evaluation to all high security prisons, detention centers, jails, and the preliminary findings are very positive. At high security institutions, we added a correctional officer to each housing unit during evenings and weekend shifts. In August 2013, the PREA audit process was implemented. To date, 15 federal prisons have been audited, and there are no major compliance issues. I want to thank the subcommittee for approving the creation of the Reentry Services Division within the Bureau. This was a critical step taken by the department and the agency to enhance our focus on the reentry portion of our mission. The Reentry Services Division is solely responsible for the oversight and coordination of the many reentry programs, services, and functions that we perform on behalf of all inmates, but particularly the more than 45,000 that return to U.S. communities each year. I'm certain this new structure will allow us to have an even greater impact on our inmate population and to work more effectively with our partners in the community. Finally, in April 2013, we expanded the medical criteria for inmates seeking reduction in sentence based on extraordinary and compelling circumstances. Last summer, the Attorney General announced additional revisions to the criteria to include categories of inmates such as elderly inmates and certain inmates who are the only possible caregiver for dependents. Again, I want to thank you, Chairman Wolf, for your leadership and many years of support to the Bureau of Prisons. I also want to thank you, Chairman Rogers and Mr. Fattah, and the entire subcommittee for your support of the Bureau of Prisons. I would be pleased to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Samuels. I'm going to recognize the chairman, Mr. Rogers, for a statement, and then, Mr. Chairman, you have any questions? Why don't you just...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the courtesy here. Mr. Director, welcome to the subcommittee. This subcommittee, over Chairman Wolf's tenure, and then before that, my own tenure here, BOP, I think, has fared very well. We've tried to take care of your crying needs, understand your problems, and try to help. And I've told numerous people in and out of the government that, in my opinion, BOP is the best run federal agency that I've run across. And I've run across, I guess, most of them. So congratulations to you and your staff. You do a good job under very difficult circumstances. And I first want to recognize the fine service of the men and women you are here representing. In my congressional district, where the Bureau has a very significant footprint, I've had the pleasure of working with hundreds of these dedicated public servants over the years who work day and night, 365 days a year, at USP McCreary, USP Big Sandy, FCI Manchester, and FCI Ashland. Their jobs are difficult, but they're important. And as you know, they tragically lost two of their friends and colleagues in 2013. We owe it to all of these men and women to ensure that when they leave their homes and their families every morning, they're leaving for a workplace that's safe and secure. I tip my hat to them for their hard work. Your budget request for 015 totaled $6.8 billion for salaries and expenses, $90 million for buildings and facilities account. That essentially is flat funding. But I'm concerned that across the Department of Justice, agencies have included unspecified, quote, administrative reductions in their budget justifications. BOP's, unfortunately, exception. And this is a $158 million hole that the committee will have to fill. Because of the unique nature of BOP's mission, these dollars are especially important. As the inmate population continues to rise, 216,000 I'm told now, our prisons get more and more crowded every day. At the end of fiscal 13, a quarter of our medium security inmates and 85% of low security inmates were triple bunked. Considering that 8 out of every 10 medium security inmates has a history of violence, this creates some very serious questions about the safety of BOP staff and other inmates. So, Mr. Director, putting aside the politically charged rhetoric about federal sentencing guidelines, the facility at Thompson and the like, I need to see more leadership from DOJ and the Bureau on that. Despite the fact that contemporary prison design affords greater efficiency in staffing and permits staff to safely oversee more inmates, your long-term budget projects no increase in facilities. In the next 5 years, we expect the prison population to increase by another 8% to over 234,000. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you on your strategy for meeting that need. It's real and here and now because of the lag time that it takes to appropriate, and plan, and build, and so on. We got to get with it pretty quick. I'm also hoping that you can discuss BOP's priorities with respect to prison reentry. As the co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus on Prescription Drug Abuse, I've long advocated for a multi-pronged approach to combating this unique public health and law enforcement challenge. Opioid-dependent individuals leaving jails and prisons have over 129 times greater risk for a fatal overdose, whether they are struggling with addiction to prescription painkillers or to heroin. Certainly, mechanisms like drug courts and prison reentry programs are important in helping these individuals begin the recovery process, since the justice system can provide both incentives and sanctions, as well as the supervision and monitoring that's offered. With over 40 deaths a day attributable to these drugs, every effort must be made to reverse the current trends, and I look forward to hearing from you on that issue especially. Mr. Chairman, regrettably, I have another commitment that precludes me from staying for the entirety of today's hearing, unfortunately. But I do thank you for your time, Mr. Director, and Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for working me in here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I have a series of questions, you just triggered one thing. On the pepper spray, did the pepper spray come from the meeting that we asked you to set up, or did it come, how did that come about? I want to be able to tell Congressman Morgan Griffith, who was interested, were you guys going to do it anyway, or did it come because of us? I don't know the answer, and I want you to just tell me so I can tell Morgan.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Griffith.
We immediately evaluated the various concerns regarding the assault issues within the Bureau relative to staff and inmates. And shortly after, I decided to move forward with a pilot. And the pilot was implemented in August of 2012. And we started out with providing the staff the opportunity to use the pepper spray in our high security institutions, which we identified 7. And as the pilot progressed and we were able to review data regarding how it was being deployed and the efficiency with it, I went a little further and expanded it to all high security facilities to include our detention facilities, and that is currently how we are operating right now. And until we can complete the entire review process, as well as look at the rules language ultimately being adopted and approved, that will determine if we go further. But right now, everything...
Did our meeting have any bearing? That's what I was trying to find out. I'm going to talk to Congressman Griffith. Hey, was that just an interesting sidebar that even if it hadn't happened, you were going to do it, or did it have an impact? I want to be...
Mr. Chairman, the concerns of Congress
Yeah.
obviously were part of the, and so it did have some impact
Okay,
on
I
us
wanted to be
looking
able to
at
tell him that.
moving forward.
Your request includes funding to sustain operating cost increases in pay and benefit adjustments, but no programmatic funding. At the same time, as was the reference of the 158 million, will the current request that you have, including training and development for normal attrition, how will you deal with 158 million whole?
What we're planning to do...
Prayer?
What we're planning to do once we receive the funding through work with the department to identify the programs and administrative areas where we would need to make some adjustments.
Okay. I have been reading some studies lately on the faith-based aspect. There's some faith-based prisons down in Texas and some other places. Have you ever been through any of the faith-based prisons?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. What is your feeling about faith-based? Because it seems to me that when an individual joins a group, joins a Bible study, is participating, you get a change of character. What are your reactions? I know the federal government runs away from anything dealing with faith, but what are your personal reactions with regard to faith-based programs?
Mr. Chairman, I'm very supportive of faith-based programs, and I also want to thank you because I know over the years you've been very, very supportive, and you've helped the Bureau move further in that direction in offering the faith-based programs, which we have the Life Connections program I know you're very familiar with, and I would confirm inmates who participate in these programs are more likely to not recidivate, and they are the best inmates as far as managing them in our institutions, and we do everything possible to try to encourage more inmates to participate in our faith-based program.
Roughly, of your population, how many are participating?
I have that information, and I can provide it before the end of the testimony,
Okay,
but I know
if you
there are
would- If you
several...
would, and just get, I can see it. The FY14 appropriation provided $1 million to initiate the Colson Task Force, named after former Chuck Colson, who has since passed away. It is tasked with finding ways to improve safety conditions at prisons, relieve overcrowding, and take a comprehensive fresh look at sentencing and incarceration. Among other things, the task force should address how we prepare inmates for reentry and reintegration into society. To do this more successfully will require money, but also fresh ideas. A couple points. How will BOP engage with the task force? We have a dedicated liaison and providing ongoing support. What areas would you suggest receive priority attention? And then lastly, and Mr. Fatal has been very, very supportive. We haven't had any differences. I think this is like a football thing where the hole opens up and there's an opportunity and a running back runs through, but then it shuts. This door will shut. And so I think there seems to be a kind of a bipartisan consensus. There seems to be a consensus out in the country, both Republicans and Democrats, reforming prisons. Sometimes, you know, at the beach when the wave comes, if you miss the wave, sometimes when the wave doesn't come for a long time, there is a wave. What are your, with regard to the Colson Task Force, your ideas, and how do we take advantage of this wave to bring about the reform that we think we need?
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First and foremost, I want to thank you because I know it was based on your leadership and other members of Congress to recommend for adoption the Chuck Colson
Mr. Totally bipartisan.
Federal Task Force on Federal Corrections, and I welcome it. And I do believe when the task force is ultimately identified and moves forward, we will be able to benefit from the findings and recommendations they will make in regards to reducing crowding, costs, and recidivism in the federal prison system. So I believe that is all going to be very beneficial, and not just to the Bureau of Prisons, but to my state colleagues and local officials as well.
Are you going to have a liaison, someone on your staff that liaisons with them? Because
Yes.
you all have a lot of resources, and
Yes, we have a lot of resources, and what we're planning to do under the direction of the Office of Justice Programs, who submitted the solicitation for the applications for this process, is to continue to work with OJP and ultimately the task force to ensure that we're working closely and providing all of the data that they will need when they're looking internally at our operating procedures and policies to ensure that those best practices that can be identified and applicable to the federal system, we're work towards that goal. So I am very, very hopeful with this initiative, and I'm looking forward to the findings as well as reviewing the final report, which I know they will be responsible for providing to the Attorney General and to Congress.
now, do you know where they are in that, how soon that will be set up? Do you know the status of that?
I know the process is moving forward. They're in the process of reviewing and identifying who the entity will be as far as the contract being awarded.
I hope they don't take too long, because if you miss this opportunity, and I think problems are going to get more difficult as we go, the very failure of both the Congress and the administration to deal with the debt and deficit, you're going to find the entitlements eating up, and all the domestic discretionary, domestic discretionary, are going to be taken down, down, down. So I really expect the next couple of years are going to be more difficult. There's not a lot of additional resources that are going to be coming. One subject, and I'm going to go to Mr. Fattah, is the federal prison industries. As in recent years, FBI and FY13 again experienced declining sales, although factory earnings rose in passenger management. How much of the decline is the consequences of FBI's loss of its mandatory source status for DoD and other agencies? And how are BOP and FBI working to expand businesses with non-DoD agencies, including components of the Justice Department? Now, the other day when the Attorney General was here, I asked him, would he send a letter to every cabinet agency asking that they look at whatever Park Service, T-shirts, baseball caps, Bureau of Land Management, every Department of Defense, to see what contracts they have out, and as they expire, as they end, to then go to you, because in the baseball cap category, and the baseball cap category is not the solution to the problem, so I want to make that clear. But it does help. I think there's only one or two domestic baseball cap manufacturers left. Most are being made in China now, and Honduras and places like that. So and the Park Service tells me, well, they've signed agreements, but as they come up, they can renegotiate. Would you ask him or let the committee know, and we're going to do the same thing with him, how important it is that he get on that, sign those letters quickly, and if you know any target-rich opportunities for him to sort of aggressively move. So I'd like to see if we can, by midsummer, have we can check when all the contracts are coming to an end. When is the Park Service contract coming to an end? Look to see what products are being used by the federal government and not in competition with the private sector. We want to make that clear. We don't want to create a problem for the FBI, but it's being done abroad. And so if you can talk to him and tell him that you and I chatted here at the hearing to make sure, one, the letters go out quickly, and that the letters be detailed in the sense that they look at their contracts as they come to an end, that they can then say, okay, we're going to begin to work all the X, Y's, and Z's, whatever it is, at different agencies to use you. But can you sort of tell us how BOP and FBI are working to expand business with non-DoD agencies?
Yes, sir. And again, I want to thank you, Chairman, and your support relative to FPI and our initiatives. And what we've done is we have reached out to well over 200 companies to have discussions regarding what we can do, with our focus being on repatriating that work to come back into the country. And as you've indicated, we're not looking for any work that takes any jobs away from American citizens, but putting a focus on what niche we could have to provide these work opportunities to give skills for inmates. And as you know, FPI is our largest recidivism reduction program with no cost to the taxpayer and is self-sufficient. We've created a business group within FPI, and they have visited trade shows, and we are seeing a benefit, and it's starting to pay off. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have been able to double the number of inmates participating in our repatriation efforts by more than 100%. We're also looking at the possibility of having the facility that we just recently activated at FCI Aliceville, which is a female institution, working with more than 200 inmates completely on work that we are repatriating back from China for those inmates to be involved in. So we see the opportunities as an area where it will continue to grow, and we will do our best to capitalize on the authorities that have been given to us to grow the work for repatriation efforts. Now, I would also mention, Mr. Chairman, that due to the difficulty and the challenges that we've had over the years, even with the repatriation efforts, when we have been able successfully to convince the companies to bring that work back and to provide these opportunities for inmates who ultimately will be released back into our communities, we are still seeing some challenges regarding that approach. But we are...
What are the challenges?
Well, the concern is, even when the work is being brought back, despite the fact that the work was moved overseas, American citizens could still do the work. And we are devoting a significant amount of time and resources trying to convince, many of these companies to give us the opportunity. And when we have been successful, there has been some criticism regarding the work being brought back.
I won't mention the company, but there's a very prominent company that's selling plastic flowers that are made by slave labor in China. Slave labor, gulags, gulags. And I think, if we can have an American, one, it helps to balance the trade, all this, but if we can have an American man or woman who's eventually going to come out of society, I think companies who participate, you can even bring in a private company, XYZ company, into the plant, let them kind of run the operation, if you will. It helps them. It also helps the guy who drives the truck in with a cloth or with a wire. So, I mean, it really is a broadening thing. Have you talked to Walmart?
We've had discussions with making an effort to try to have conversation with Walmart. However, their current practice is they do not utilize inmate labor, and so we're hoping.
Is there a reason why they don't?
It's
They're a good company.
Corporate policy, and so this is their area where we will continue to try to work with.
Well, let us know if we can help with regard to that. Also, if you would call the Secretary of Commerce. We had the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Pritzker, yesterday, and she's putting on, with the cooperation of the committee, a repatriation conference whereby American companies are urgent. And I think you should have a participant, not necessarily on the program, but there, and also to see the companies that she's inviting back, because we're all part of the same government, if you will. So this is a repatriation conference of American companies, urging them to return home. And so they may very well return home, and they can have a cooperative arrangement with the FBI. So none of these jobs will take a job away from an American citizen. All these jobs will give an American citizen, i.e. people who are in prison, a job, and also help as they get out of jobs, as they get out of prisons, to transfer into those jobs. So,
Mr. Chairman, I would also add that for the companies we've been able to partner with, I mean, they've been very, very pleased with the service we provide and the work labor. And I know they're very also appreciative of the fact that they are assisting with our reentry efforts. And we do everything that we can to ensure that money spent when you look at purchasing raw material, that we are buying from local businesses, so we are returning all of the money back into the communities, which we know also helps society and with the economy, as well. So our goal is always just to ensure that we're providing the opportunities for the inmates, but being good stewards to ensure that we're not taking advantage,
Right.
no more than necessary, to do what we can for the inmates ultimately being released and providing all of the funds appropriately back into the community.
And as I go to Mr. Fatah, also, the inmate gets training so that when he or she leaves, they have a place to go. You can't put a person in prison for 15 years and give them no work. If they have that training and skill, it's less likely that they will return to prison. That saves the taxpayer money. It also may commit a crime, keep a crime from being committed. They also have the opportunity to put some of the money that they earn into where they send to their families, also for restitution. So, I mean, it's what I would like you to do is put together the most powerful 2 or 3 page thing, and what I'm going to do is drop something in the congressional record explaining that maybe you all can then take and go out to American companies. And I'm a conservative Republican. My dad was a Philadelphia policeman. I mean, I'm tough on crime. I'm not. But on the other hand, I think this is a very positive thing. So if you can give that to me, we will put it in, and you all can take it as an opportunity to go out. And then if you will call Secretary Pritzker to have a person to participate to see if that repatriation conference can help you. I think this is a unique opportunity. We invented the color television set. Black and white color television set. There are no televisions made in the United States. I remember I had Lorton Reformatory was ready. We were trying to bring, I think it was Emerson, in, and then all of a sudden the thing kind of fell. So we don't make any television sets. Repatriate back some things like this, not just baseball caps, but things like the television sets and radios. I think it could be a rejuvenate. It's not going to solve the problem, so if anyone thinks this is, but it's going to help. And lastly, I think we owe it to the individuals in dignity to give them work. You know, work is important. Anyway, Mr. Fatah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask you a question. Let me start with solitary confinement. To what degree is this utilized, prevalent, and what are the concerns, and what are you looking at in terms of the continued use of it inside the federal prison system?
Thank you. When I entered the position of director in 2011, December of 2011, we had well over 13,000 inmates in some form of restrictive housing. And we have since looked at ourselves very, very closely to ensure inmates removed from the general population and placed in restrictive housing, there are appropriate reasons for the placement. And first and foremost, to ensure the safety of staff, inmates, and the public. And as a result of our internal assessment, we have since reduced the number specifically for our special housing unit to little less than 9,000 inmates. The majority of our inmates are placed in restrictive housing for administrative segregation purposes, which could be for a number of factors: classification reasons, their safety, investigation. And I have stressed to staff repeatedly, as well as my predecessors, that we should, again, only use the form of restrictive housing for the appropriate reasons, and we should be just as concerned to get the inmates out of restrictive housing just as much as we are to put them in, provided there's no ongoing threat to
Well, just so that the record is clear, why is that a concern? Why isn't solitary confinement a great idea for the inmate?
If inmates are placed in for long periods of time, I mean, there is a concern relative to their mental health. And we have to ensure, as an agency, that we're providing adequate resources for these individuals to have access to our mental health care providers, and that is part of our policy.
So it's clear, right, the mental health experts, you know with a certainty that long-term solitary confinement is not going to benefit the inmate's mental health, right? We do know this from experience.
I would say, based on the literature and the subject matter experts,
Right.
we have to ensure that there is some form of access. But Congressman, I would also offer, if we have individuals within our population who pose a significant threat to the safety of
Okay, let's-
inmates and staff. We have to ensure that
So there would be no circumstances in our system then where someone who doesn't pose a safety threat to our staff or other inmates would be put in solitary confinement then?
you're correct.
Okay. Now, I'm in favor of the use of pepper spray, and for one reason is that, you know, one of the big challenges inside our prisons is mental health, and therefore injuries to one's head is not a great way to help improve the mental health of inmates, right? So utilizing non-physical force, I think, is very, very useful. And also, we lost Eric Williams in Pennsylvania, and we know that there is a real life concern for prison guards in your staff in these facilities. So you have 119 facilities, you have 216,000 inmates. What can you tell us about this population? What's their educational attainment level? What's their, what do you know about, what could you tell the committee about these 216,000 people? A significant part of them are non-American citizens, some number of them, right?
Yes, sir.
What percentage is that?
It is approximately, number-wise, 50,000 plus inmates are non-U.S. citizens.
Okay, so the American citizens, is there anything that you could tell the committee about who these individuals are, generally speaking? Let's start with their educational attainment level.
Many of the inmates who come into the federal prison system are lacking in areas of education. And with our educational programs, we are offering these individuals the adult continuing education courses, as well as English as a second language, and doing everything that we can to ensure that they are working towards obtaining a GED.
So the majority of these inmates have access to educational programs?
Yes, sir.
And is this in the facility with actual instructors? How is this?
Actual instructors inside our facilities, our
Okay.
teachers.
So, and when you say adult education, you mean GED programs?
Yes, sir.
So the majority of these inmates don't have a high school diploma?
Correct.
Okay. And could you characterize to any degree their reading levels?
I would have to provide the specifics to
Okay.
the various levels.
Well, I really would like to get the specifics. And Mr. Chairman, if you would be so kind, I'd like to put some language in that would require us to have this information so that we could act intelligently ourselves about what it is that we're doing, right?
We can provide that information.
We could know more about because 45,000 are being released each year, right? So in my community, in the chairman's neighborhood, all across the country, almost 50,000 inmates are coming out each year. Another 50,000 are going in. A little more than 50,000 are going in as the numbers are going up, right? So the question of whether or not they are in a better position to navigate their way through society is a very important question, not just for the returning inmate, but for everybody that we represent, right? So while we have them and we have their attention, and they are it would seem to me that if there's any possibility of improving their life chances, as the chairman has said, whether for job skills, vocational training, that it's in the country's interest to do everything possible so that when they walk out of the door, they're in a better position to not have to victimize me or you or our families or our communities, and that they can make a decent living and be able to read and write and everything else that somehow got missed along the way, right? So now, the other thing is that in the statistics, it seems as though somewhere the children of these inmates, the stats suggest, are the most likely future inmates in your system. That is to say that the children of people who are in prison have a very difficult time, and many of them end up in prison. And so I'd be interested in this data, as you could tell, family composition, and whether there are children, and what our program is to allow inmates to continue to have contact with their children, and if anything we can learn from the federal system. Now, The state systems have 2 million inmates, so it's a big challenge. But it seems to me that if there's a way to solve any of these problems, it's through you being I've never heard the chairman commend an agency the way that your agency was commended. So people know that you're doing a good job. The question is, you're doing a good job in a very tough environment with a very tough problem, and it's still not going in the right direction. That is, we're adding inmates, and we haven't been able to conquer the recidivism issue. And the mental health issues inside the prisons seem to be extraordinary. And many of your policies may actually add to the problem rather than subtract from it. So I'm interested in trying to find a way where we can make even more headway here.
Okay. Congressman, I can give you it's 23% are non-U.S. citizens. And for
23% non-U.S. Okay.
percent. And in regards to the children of incarcerated inmates, this is something that I strongly believe as an agency we have a duty and obligation to work with inmates to ensure that there is a relationship with their child, because that also helps with our reentry efforts, having the relationship intact. And we have very good parenting programs throughout the Bureau of Prisons and in all of our institutions. And in December time ever, we had a Universal Children's Day devoted towards the effort of having the inmate and child spend quality time together, facilitated by our staff. We had well over 4,000 inmates participate and approximately 8,000 children, and that's not including the caregivers who were also there to participate. And this is a commitment that I have given for the agency to ensure that it's not just something that's done on a day to highlight this very important area, but we will continue to do agency-wide throughout the year as we continue to move forward. And as I mentioned, we've always had parenting programs, but we are just trying to ensure that the effort is there, and we're doing everything possible to assist these children as well as the parents, so we do not have this cycle of these children not having the support and or being mentored properly by their parents who are incarcerated.
Two more questions, and maybe they can, you can supply, or we're going to put it in the language, hopefully, with the chairman's permission. I'm interested in what percentage of these 216,000 people are first-time offenders and nonviolent offenders in both categories, and where they double index, that is, that both their first time and their nonviolent. And the last thing is, since this is an appropriations hearing, if you could give the committee now or in the future your sense of what the average cost is to house an inmate.
The average cost agency-wide is approximately $29,000 a year.
Okay, and what is the average cost of new cell construction?
The average cost for new cell construction, depending on the security level, if we were to look at a high security facility, we're talking in excess of $400 million. And
not per cell.
Not per cell. The
right, no,
total
I'm talking about per cell construction. So you're saying $400 million for a facility,
yes,
right? But do you have a 4-cell average for new construction?
Not per cell.
Okay.
But we can get that for you, a formula for that.
Right. If we're going to have a growth in population, we're going to add facilities. I'm just trying to understand what the cost is to house. I got the annual cost.
Yes.
And that doesn't include the infrastructure. So I'm trying to figure out, like, in terms of building a facility or adding a bed, or maybe it's a per bed number. Do you have a per bed number for construction?
Do we have a? Yeah, we'll get it for
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm going to go to Mr. Cole. But as you're gathering data, too, we can also, back to the Unicor thing, try to get some of the products like television sets, radios, different electronic, kind of a higher level, if you will, that are all made outside of the United States. For instance, there are no televisions made in the U.S. If we can see if we can kind of get a list that goes up to the next level, that takes it from baseball caps and T-shirts to that, if you can kind of get somebody to do that and report back to the committee. Mr. Culberson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Samuels, we've had a very successful prison industry program in Texas, Mr. Chairman. It's worked very, very well. I served for a number of years on the Corrections Committee in the Texas House, and they made all the furniture for the Texas state government. Inmates in the federal prison system still make furniture for the federal government?
Yes.
But the gentleman would yield, in defense of them, we in the Congress have hurt them. We literally have made it very tough. We don't want them to compete with the private sector, but so much has been done, and the number of prison industry who are working as at, what was the high level?
24,000,
And what is it now?
13,000.
And it's not their fault, it really is the fault of the
Congress changed the law and restricted their ability to compete with the private sector. It's something I strongly support the chairman, and I would be happy to help you make sure we get that changed, because it doesn't make sense, particularly
you.
when you're importing products from, as the chairman quite correctly points out, slave labor camps in communist China. Is appalling. And I wanted to ask about your use of private facilities. We've also had great success in Texas using private contractors to come in and build and operate private facilities that are, of course, whether they're at the county level or the state level, operate at a significant savings to taxpayers and provide, frankly, better facilities, better food, better health care. And the private sector will do everything from transportation to food to health care, and they also assume any liability problems. To what extent is the federal prison system using private contractors to build and operate facilities?
Thank you, Congressman. We have approximately 30,000 inmates in 14 private prisons, and they serve a role for the Bureau of Prisons by our low-security criminal aliens.
Do you have the ability to expand that number? Is there any kind of a limit or restriction other than, of course, obviously the financial restrictions? What restrictions are there on your ability to expand that 30,000 bed utilization?
Well, to move forward with expanding, we have to look at competing resource interests operationally within the Bureau if we were to use funding to move forward with adding additional beds. And so at this point, right now with our population, the 14 facilities is currently serving our needs.
However, I see your population growth from fiscal year 6 through 11 exceeded a 7% increase in your rated capacity. What is your, let's see, my staff tells me that in 2011, crowding was 55% over your rated capacity in the maximum security facilities. You've obviously got a crowding problem. What can this committee do to help you expand your utilization of private facilities?
Well, very good question. And first and foremost, I mean, for us to expand, it would require additional funding to operate those contracts. And as you've mentioned, at our high security facilities, we are currently at 53% over rated capacity and 43% over rated capacity for our mediums. And our low security facilities, which is the targeted population we use to place under a contract with the privates, we are in a triple bunking situation. And when we look at rated capacity for the federal system, we have identified for our minimum security, low security facilities, we are comfortable with double bunking those facilities, but we are in a situation where we are triple bunking. So the crowding concerns are significant, and we do our best to manage with, as I mentioned, the 14 private facilities to include our overall management for the low security inmates that we have placed within our institutions. And also approximately 2,500 low security criminal aliens in BOP low security facilities.
We also use them for the low to medium security in Texas as well, so I agree with you in that, sir. And I hope the subcommittee can do whatever we can, Mr. Chairman, to help them expand the use of private facilities. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Actually, a lot of the things that I was thinking about have already been asked. But let me, when I was listening to Mr. Culberson, I also recalled back to my state legislative years. And in some cases, the work system, in Florida it's called Pride, was was working really, really well. I'm going back now a number of years, and my memory may fail me, but I also recall that there were some cases where there was no improvement over those that were involved in the work system and those that were not, as far as recidivism rates. Do we have those studies that show that is there a noticeable difference?
Yes, Congressman, for inmates, and I'll use federal prison industries as an anticipate compared to those who don't, they're 16% less likely to recidivate, and so that is a significant public safety issue, and this is why it's so important that we continue to do everything that we can to keep our federal prison industries program active.
And that's 16%, and we're talking about apples to apples, right? The same kind of inmates, the same kind of, and any idea how much, if we are saving by not having those folks come back? I mean, what does that 16% mean in actually just dollars? It's got to be significant as well.
Just for every inmate, based on our overall average, you're looking at $29,000
Right.
per inmate, with the average cost to incarcerate an inmate within our system.
But I wonder what that 16%. I don't know how many inmates that would be. I wonder if that would be, because that's got to be substantial. There's got to be a pretty substantial savings because of that 16%. I would imagine. I don't know how many folks are involved, but it would seem to me that it's got to be pretty substantial savings, right?
The gentleman yield for that.
Sure, of course.
There are numbers. The committee has been funding a number of these efforts that are called justice reinvestment strategies, right? In the base by intervening in a more constructive way. And there are a host of them, including some 600 second chance or reentry related programs. So, and we'll be glad to get you some more information about this. Right.
And federal prison industry's overall impact on recidivism is 24%.
Okay. Because that's, and I'm glad to hear that. And obviously, as we know with every program, in any program, there are some that work better than others. And but those that do work, I mean, when you're talking about the cost per inmate, that's real money. I mean, you're talking about real money here. So, anyways, I would love if that is readily available, I'd love to see some of those numbers. Remember, you got to give it to us in ways that we can digest, right? But anyways, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Fatal? Or we make sure, Ms. Schiff, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I wanted to just follow up on some comments that Mr. Fatal made earlier on the issue of solitary confinement. This is an issue I've raised my concern about in the past when you came before our committee. Certainly, correctional officers have very dangerous jobs, and their safety has to be paramount. But there's a large body of evidence suggesting that solitary confinement is profoundly and irreparably damaging to mental health. I want to call your attention to a news story in the Chicago Sun-Times over the weekend that reported that our former colleague, Jesse Jackson, Jr., who was sentenced to 2.5 years in a minimum security facility in North Carolina, was placed in solitary for 4 days in retaliation for informing other inmates about their rights. This is disturbing to me on multiple levels. First, I can't imagine a situation in which it would be appropriate to place an inmate in solitary confinement, let alone for multiple days, because of what he said to other inmates. Second, it's public knowledge that Mr. Jackson has struggled with mental illness, and the damaging effects of solitary are magnified for people with mental illness. If this happens to high-profile prisoners, I have to imagine it happens to a lot of prisoners that are less the subject of public attention. So I wonder if you could share with me what kind of criteria are being used for solitary, how much progress we're making on the issue that goes beyond solitary, but in dealing with the mental health problems of those who are confined.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. As I mentioned earlier, we've made significant strides in reducing our restrictive housing population, and not being able to give any specifics regarding the example you've given. Anytime there is the possibility of a threat against an individual, whether high profile or not, we have a duty and obligation to assess the threat and ensure that the individual is protected. And the only way of ensuring we're able to carry that out is to have the individual removed from general population. And we will do everything possible to ensure when we are assessing the concerns and a possible threat, the individual's not in that status for a significant period of time, and do everything to move them out. And this is something agency-wide, and with the system having more than 170,000 for those individuals, we managed to include the other 40+ thousand in our contractual prisons. We have to monitor, as well. So we're very, very large. And when you look at the number of individuals who are placed in restrictive housing for discipline purposes, that number is less than 2,000. And generally, the discipline for placement in DS is a specific period of time, which once they serve it, and it is to correct the behavior to ensure that we are managing safe, secure prisons to hold individuals accountable. No different than when laws are broken and individuals are sent to prison. We have a order within the prison environment to ensure the protection of staff, inmates, as well as the public. And for individuals who are placed in the administrative segregation portion of restrictive housing, as I've stated, we will do everything, and we continue to do all we can to ensure that we are closely monitoring those cases to get these individuals back out. Because I will agree that it is easier for us to manage inmates when they are in general population, and that is the preferred status for all inmates in our system. But we have to ensure that we're protecting staff and inmates and appropriately using restrictive housing.
Do I understand, though, that then there are a couple criteria for a solitary confinement? One is an inmate poses a danger to staff or to other inmates or themselves. And the second broad category is for discipline. That's unrelated to a safety concern. Is that correct?
Yes.
So in that second category, has the BOP done any research to figure out whether, in fact, putting people in solitary as a method of discipline, ensuring discipline, actually works? Have we done any research to find out whether people who are put in solitary tend to do become less of a disciplinary problem, or they're put in solitary, they tend to become more of a disciplinary problem, or in fact it has no impact at all? Have we done that research?
We're currently being evaluated via an independent assessment by CNA Analysis Solutions. And towards the end of the year, they will be providing their findings and recommendations regarding best practices based on our operating procedures for restrictive housing. And this is another assessment that I am looking forward to review based on their recommendations to identify if there are any significant concerns in any areas within the federal system we need to consider. This would be comparable to them looking at the corrections profession, not just within the Bureau, but what some of the other practices are that are out there.
Do we know, though, whether that analysis will include a study of whether, in fact, it achieves its desired end?
I don't believe that the study would be able to make that assessment, because that would be something relative to research that would require a targeted time frame for researchers to look at. And we are welcome to that type of research and to have that done, but it would be something that would take a couple of years, to assess that.
I would encourage us to do it. I think it would be valuable for the federal system as well as for the states to know if, in fact, this only makes the problem worse in terms of discipline. Otherwise, we're playing blind, and we may be doing things that are counterproductive. Let me turn to one other question. I see there's an proposed increase for RDAP. Are we at the point yet where any inmate who has a substance abuse problem that wants treatment can get that treatment in BOP?
Yes. In FY 2013, we added an additional 18 residential drug abuse programs, and currently we have 87 programs at 77 locations. All inmates who met our eligibility criteria were given the opportunity to participate.
But is that criteria defined in such a way that there are still inmates who have a need for it, want it, and can't get it, either because they have language barriers or for other reasons don't meet the criteria?
Now, we're providing it for all inmates, and part of the expansion, what we've done is we've added 2 Spanish residential drug abuse programs, one for male and one for female, to ensure that we're addressing that specific issue.
Well, if I recall correctly, the part of the criteria, doesn't it depend on how far away they are from release?
Yes.
And does that mean, as a practical matter, that if you're too close to release or too far away from release, you may not get the treatment you need?
No, the way we have it set up, every inmate will be given an ample opportunity to participate. And we do, as you've mentioned, we focus on those inmates who are closer to release to ensure that they are given the opportunity to participate, and we have a waiting list for inmates who have a release date that's further out.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Officer safety, how many attacks occur each year, and how many officers are hospitalized or injured each year, on an average?
I'd have to provide you the specifics for that.
Last couple of years, do you have any anecdotal that you can think of now, or
To give you accurate information, we can provide that for the record.
how many officers have been killed in the last 5 years?
In the last 5 years, we've had 3.
3. We have a pepper spray question, which I think you really may have covered. Well, let me mace could protect officers working alone in facilities that are overcrowded. This was the circumstance that faced Officer Eric Williams when he was murdered in 2013, as well as the correctional officer Jose Rivera, who died at Atwater Penitentiary in California. How many of the attacks occur when an officer is isolated by himself?
If you look at the specifics for our housing units, we typically have one officer working with approximately 130 inmates, but that was up until recently, towards the end of last year, when I mentioned in our high security facilities, using existing resources, we've added an additional officer for the evening and weekend coverage to offset the balance. But even with that, sir, we're still looking at 130 inmates who outnumber 2 staff.
So wouldn't it make sense, or would it make sense for every officer to be able to carry the mace? Is that a discouraging factor? I know they don't.
What we've done, and we continue to do with the pilot, is we have looked at historically the trends on where assaults typically occur, and we have identified our housing units, recreation area, special housing units, and these are areas where we have given authorization under the pilot for our staff to carry OC, to include the compound areas where we have staff who work the post. We are being very, very careful with our assessment because we want to ensure if this is being utilized as a tool which benefits staff and inmates, we are not wanting to, we don't want to move too fast and inmates have access unnecessarily with having the OC, which could also jeopardize our staff, as well. With the pilot, we haven't seen that to be a concern and nor an issue, but we have to evaluate and continue to make the assessments as we move along.
Of the attacks on, what percentage are in the maximum, minimum, where do they all come from?
The majority of the attacks are occurring in our high security facilities. And these are the inmates within our population who are more prone to violence.
Now, if you were to bring back, which I'm opposed to closing down Guantanamo and bringing them back. But if you were to quickly close down Guantanamo Bay and bring those prisoners to the Bureau of Prisons, what would that do to the Bureau of Prisons system at this time?
If that were a scenario that would happen, I mean, we would be able to integrate those inmates in our institutions.
Would it put a great burden on Bureau of Prisons?
No, right now we have inmates who are comparable to these individuals as far as disruptive behavior or any other attributes that we would need to monitor in our higher security facilities.
Okay.
And we would be able to do it relatively easily with no significant concerns.
Now, have you been involved with Guantanamo? If I recall, I think when I was down there, they told me they had checked everything out with you all. Is that accurate? In how to operate the prison, different procedures?
They've reached out to the Bureau, and we've had discussions on a number
Have
of
you had
different
people
issues.
go down there and look at the system and have you had anyone from Bureau of Prison visit Guantanamo?
Yes.
Yes, you have. And make recommendations?
We've provided insight and operating procedures for the Bureau.
Okay. Back to the original of the attacks, breaking them down again in category percentage. Most are from the high security.
Yes.
As you get down, is it almost non-existent in the low security?
We have assaults that occur in our low security
Against
facilities.
guards or against
Oh,
another?
Correctional staff and
But I'm
inmates.
looking now, let's talk about staff. 100% of the attacks, what percentage come in high security, medium security, and low?
We can provide you the information for the record.
Okay, good. Well, last week, the Inspector General testified that inmate to staff ratios are far higher in federal facilities, which average 10 inmates per officer, than in states where the average is 6.1. Do you agree with those observations?
Yes.
And so how are the attacks in state and local prisons compare with the attacks in federal prisons? In comparable populations, not numbers so much, but in the type of crimes.
If you were to look at the largest state, it
What one is that? Is that California?
would be California, Texas. And the Bureau of Prisons, as you know, all of our staff who work in the field are considered correctional workers. An example I would give, in many state systems, if a teacher is responsible for teaching in the classroom, more often you would have a correctional officer assigned to the area with the teacher. In the Bureau, the teacher is responsible for being the educator as well as the correctional worker, serving in the role as the correctional officer would be. So we are not able to provide the additional security that we would need for the large numbers of inmates that we have within our system. And so the overall inmate to staff ratio for the Bureau is a little under 5 to 1. And when you look at the larger state systems, the ratio is 3 to 1. So we are significantly outnumbered and have been for many, many years. As our population continues to grow, we have not been able to keep pace with our staffing levels.
Like how does your staffing level per inmate and per guard compare to, say, California, Texas, and New York?
As I mentioned, we're right at 5 to 1 when you look at our overall staffing. And I believe with California, if you were to look at theirs, is going to be slightly close to 3 to 1.
In the long term, crowding can be reduced by reducing the intake of prisoners, which you don't control, having more space, which takes a long time and money, moving people out through prison and sentencing. However, your most optimistic projection shows that the slight reduction in overcrowding will be reversed and climb to 41% by 2019. Your request indicates this estimate is based on projections from the courts, the U.S. Marshal, and other DOJ information. It also assumes you'll add another about 7,000 new spaces between now and the end of FY16. but no new capacity thereafter. Is this your most optimistic projection based on full funding of your request?
Yes, and yes.
Yes, it is.
And I would offer, sir, with the Attorney General's initiative for Smart on Crime, and we are very, very hopeful that it will help reduce our population. And we are also hoping that with the U.S. Sentencing Commission looking at the possibility of offering an approach to have sentencing reform will be considered to include the Congress. It will help us in the out years with our growing population. As was mentioned earlier by Congressman Fattah, when you look at the growth over the years, in 1940, we had approximately 26,000 inmates, and from 1940 to 1980, you're looking at 40 years where the population was pretty flat and steady.
Why?
And,
Why?
well, when you look at the law enforcement initiatives in 1980 to include the legislation with the Sentencing Reform Act and other legislative measures, the growth, and you mentioned earlier, I mean, we grew well over 800% with our population, and our staffing has not kept pace. And when you have more inmates in a facility than the facility was designed to house, you have the propensity for violence to increase, and the growth alone, I'm not going to say is the contributing factor to violence, but we have a significant gang issue within the Bureau of Prisons. More than 9% of our population is comprised of gang members, well over 20,000 gang members, and we are doing our best to try to mitigate the gang problem by having a strategic approach on how we manage these individuals. And many of these gangs are very, very violent, as you are aware, and we have many of these gang members within our facility to include the gang leaders.
That's what I was going to ask you about. I'm going to go to Mr. Fattah, but let me just ask you on the gang issue. You say 9%?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And is it, what was it, say, 10 years ago? Is it growing, stable, declining?
It has grown, I mean, obviously due to the increase of our population, but
Percentage-wise?
I have to give you the percentage for the record.
Violence-wise?
Violence-wise,
I mean, in the 30s and 40s or 50s in the Bureau of Prisons, was it as, what did you have as, I know individuals, but did you have the violent gangs then? Was it different type of gangs? What has changed?
well,
And that put more of a stress on.
one of the things I will mention as far as a change, and not to say in the 30s and the 40s, I mean, they were not dealing, I mean, with similar issues, but we are seeing more younger, aggressive individuals come into the prison system involved in the gangs, and it is an area of concern where we're dealing with large numbers with these individuals who are also serving very, very, I mean, long sentences. I mean, we have done our best to counter and have measures in place to deal with the population by utilizing cognitive behavioral therapy, which we've established programs to target these specific individuals to ensure that they are participating. And we also know that as an inmate, using this as an example, as they continue to move towards completing their sentence over a period of time, as they become more older, and some might say wiser, they're less likely to be involved in disruptive behavior within the facility.
My last question for Mr. Fattah, on the age, the average age now is what compared to what it was 1950? Because the violence, studies show that the younger are more, so
The-
sure that the age is dropping fairly dramatically, or is it going from 46 to 45 or 40,
Well, the average age for our population right now is 40.
40, and what was it 20, 30, 40 years ago?
I would need to provide that for the record, which we can.
But is there a dramatic drop? Are we seeing, I mean, you said they're getting younger, but are they getting much so, or just,
Just significant numbers coming in, but we will provide the specifics regarding the age and the time frame.
okay, Mr. Mr. Fatah?
Well, I agree with the chairman. And let me just say, because we need to conclude, at least in terms of being able to go vote, is that we need a prison system that can house people who society needs to be protected from, right? We don't need a prison system in which people who don't need to be in prison are in prison, right? And in their life choices altered in a way in which they can lead less productive lives, right? So, we have to figure out how to make the changes that need to be made. It's not really your burden in the sense that we're the lawmakers, we're the policymakers in this. But we need more information, right? So the Attorney General's efforts on Smart on Crime, the Chairman's leadership that led to this Prison Reform Task Force, the Colson Task Force, the work of people who have very different political viewpoints ranging from Rand Paul to Dick Durbin and others who have some legislation over in the Senate on this issue, right? We can work together, and I think the Chairman's point is that there's a window here in which something important could be done on behalf of the country. Because when we have dangerous people on the street, harming people, and a threat to society, we need to have prisons available for them. But we can't be in a situation where we're taking a writer and putting them in jail, and we don't have room for, murderers, rapists, kidnappers. I mean, it just doesn't make sense at the end of the day. And we got to figure this out. And there's nobody else to figure it out. We had to do it on our watch. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fidel. I just have about 2 or 3 more last questions. The age issue I want to get before I leave on because as it gets younger, you're saying it gets more violent. But as it gets older, less violence. But as it gets older, more medical cost. So it's sort of...
You're correct.
Yeah. Our concern with prison gangs is their potential to contribute to indoctrination or radicalization of inmates, including making them susceptible to potential exploitation by terrorists or other violent groups. Could you describe how BOP works with the interagency community to monitor and report on developments related to gang organizations and potential connections with terrorism, to include working with Joint Terrorist Task Force and other national security or intelligence agencies?
Yes, we are very active with our law enforcement partners relative to gang-related specific issues, to include international and domestic terrorism. And we have staff within the Bureau of Prisons who are assigned to the various JTTFs throughout the country. And we monitor very, very closely all of the issues regarding the concerns within the prison system to ensure not only are we doing everything we can to detect and disrupt any inappropriate activity within the Bureau, that we're also working closely and sharing information with the law enforcement community for any potential threat that could carry over into the communities. And it has been working very, very well. And I know, of course, with your leadership and involvement and oversight as well, I know a couple of years ago I sat in on one of the briefings provided to you with the law enforcement community on the various initiatives that we're working with. We are ensuring that with the Bureau's responsibility that we are providing the intelligence and ensuring that if there are any requests submitted to the Bureau, that we're working closely to immediately ensure that any potential threats, as I've mentioned, is eradicated.
Before your time, years ago, we looked at some of that literature that was being sent in on radicalization was very dangerous. Can you pretty much assure us that you have stopped the radicalization of literature that was coming in by certain elements?
Yes, I can give assurances to the subcommittee. It is a very, very extremely high priority for the Bureau, and we review all material communications to prevent any form of radicalization internally within the Bureau, and to also prevent any dangerous material or issues being communicated outside with our monitoring procedures.
Efforts to block cell phones in prison. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, sir. We are exploring technology, and the most recent technology that's being used, and I know some state systems have it in place, is managed access. And we are undergoing the review process of having 2 pilots within the Bureau utilizing the technology. One of the areas we still have to work out the legal requirements regarding the contracting issues and access for delivery of the services. And we want to make sure, because the use of managed access is very expensive, that before we move further with obligating any taxpayer dollars towards this science, that we're very, very comfortable with what it can offer.
I'm going to ask this last question and go to Mr. Fatah, Mr. Culberson, Mr. Fatah, but I think we covered it briefly, but I think we need it for the record because it deals with a lot of the issue we're dealing with, the cost, but also on how do you treat elderly versus the other. The Inspector General testified last week that BOP's inmate population is aging, which seemed to run a little counter with what you had earlier said, with a 31% increase since 2010 in the population of inmates over the age of 65 and a corresponding decrease in the population under 30. That's why I was a little confused what you're saying. This has cost implications. How has this democratic change affected the medical cost for the Bureau of Prisons? And then secondly, your budget indicates that medical costs have grown 71% since '05 from $350 million to $600 million. Last week, the Inspector General testified the cost rose higher to 977. So here was 205, 350 million. 211, 977 million. So what is your estimate for the total cost of providing for inmate health? How has it risen, and what will your estimate be for 2015?
Okay. Yes, I want to clarify. I mean, my comments regarding the younger offenders coming into the system, I mean, that is something that is happening. But then at the same time, because of the number of individuals who are serving long sentences and will continue to do so under the current structure, we will always be faced with the aging and growing population. And that is obviously, as you've mentioned, a great concern, for the Bureau of Prisons because the medical costs are significant. We are currently spending in excess for overall care for our population $1 billion.
Billion.
$1 billion. And I would offer, again, if you were to look at the size of our population, you can compare us to the larger correctional state systems. $1 billion, I know, is a lot of money, but with the efficiencies we have in place, a lot of the contracts that we're working to consolidate, that we are still managing the overall cost for medical care appropriately. But if we continue to grow, the cost will continue to go up.
So $1 billion for health care, and what is your total budget?
Well, for the FY15 request, we're looking at 6.8.
So, boy, that's... Mr. Culberson, and then we'll end here.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The healthcare costs don't include optional or cosmetic type surgery, does it? I mean, you really focus on the essentials.
These are the essentials. Under our policy, we do not offer surgery.
Nor should you, you bet. We actually ran into that, Mr. Chairman, on the Texas Corrections Committee, found a guy that wanted the state to pay for a sex change operation. That doesn't happen in the federal prison system with federal tax dollars, does it?
Well, currently, we have not done it, and it would be something where if it were to occur relative to a legal issue, if we are engaged in that type of discussion, if we are told that we would have to do it.
It's not currently prohibited by federal law or federal, for example, restrictions on appropriations? It lit up the Texas legislature, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Fatah, as you can imagine.
Yes, I would want to provide, for the record, a
I
legal...
really wasn't even going to bring it up till you mentioned this, but...
Maybe we should carry some language for prohibiting, particularly because, we want to support the system and do everything we can for rehabilitation
Sure.
and correction. And so if you start entering things like this,
I think what he said is that they don't do it.
no,
It was ordered by a court of law in our
I can't,
country.
but I want to
He would
make
have
sure
to,
that you don't do it on your own, because then I think you're going to find, I think we're at a unique time. I mean, Mr. Fatah and I work closely together, and I know you look outside, some of the groups that come by, they're conservative and they're liberal. And we don't want to hurt that consensus that appears to be. I mean, do you agree with me? It appears to now be whereby we can do some fairly significant things in prison. Seems to be a coming together.
Yes.
So if we interject something like this, you could just take that away. And so, you know, I just don't think you should ever do that. I can't stop when the court tells you to do, I mean, we're not, but on your own, do not ever do that.
Just and with all due respect, as Congressman Fatah, mentioned, I do not want to make an agency confirmation as far as a statement, because it would require, if we were looking at any potential issue like that, a legal review, and I just offer that, to the subcommittee.
Sure, and I wasn't even going to bring it up until you started, because I can tell you the entire Texas legislature, it lit us up. It caused a bad problem. And there is a wave, as Chairman Wolf said, of agreement, and Mr. Fatah has been wonderful. This subcommittee works together beautifully, and I think you should, as the Chairman suggested, take advantage of that wave of support and unanimity on so many issues when it comes to rehabilitation and preventing radicalization and in the prison system, which is what I really wanted to ask about, just to follow up on some of the Chairman's questions, in particular in the process for vetting chaplains. Have you changed the process for vetting chaplains? How are you vetting them, particularly in light of the findings by the House Homeland Security Committee?
Yes, our procedures, still stand where we vet chaplains coming into any employment situation with the federal government to ensure that there are no concerns, and if so, we deal with those.
No concerns such as?
Any issues that would pose concerns with their employment, within the agency that.
Such as?
We employ.
What would cause a concern?
If someone was seeking employment within the Bureau and their agenda is not in line with our policies and procedures and ultimately, what we would be responsible for carrying out under the law. And if there were any issues raised that it would cause concern relative to safety and security within our facilities, then we would have great concern with that, and we would not be moving forward with an offer of employment.
And I may need your help with this, Mr. Chairman, because you're a lot more knowledgeable about this than I am. But what about communication affiliation with some of these radical sects in the Islamic world?
And this would
How do
be,
you flesh that out?
and that would be part of, again, working with our partners. And if something is brought to our attention that raises that level of concern, it would be something that we would really, have to look at very, very closely.
I always remember Chairman Wolf had Mr. Chairman, the school in Northern Virginia was a Saudi-funded mosque. What was it that you had in Northern Virginia? That was a
It still operates, the Saudi Academy.
Saudi
And the head of the Saudi Academy is the Saudi ambassador. And they found anti-Semitic and anti-Christian material in the textbooks. And also, and I want to supply this for the record so we have it exactly right, the valedictorian, one of the years, I think has been sentenced. He's in your prison system now. Do you recall that case? Anybody recall that?
I don't recall the specifics of the case.
Well, we'll give you all the details because it was, and I want to clarify it, so we're, I think, for an attempt, planning an attempt on assassination of the president. And it was a graduate of. And so we will, for the record, we'll submit something in so you have it. With that, I'll go back to Mr. Cole.
That's a real concern. And I certainly understand your perspective should be to make sure that you're not allowing chaplains in that could potentially, violate prison policy, et cetera. But this is a little amorphous. We want to make sure that you're keeping chaplains out any involvement with, connection to some of these really violent, dangerous, anti-Semitic sects in the Islamic world?
Yes, and I would offer, Congressman, I mean,
Any, or frankly, anybody.
Yes, we have
It doesn't matter, we'll just
very
single them out.
good, dedicated chaplains working within the Bureau of Prisons who provide services for a number of religious, faiths. And if at any time we are informed, or if there's any intelligence, and no different for any employee working within the Bureau, I mean, we will immediately deal with that issue and take care of it, as well as with the vetting process for anyone seeking employment within the Bureau.
If someone's employed, allowed access to the prison system, you've got the ability to check into their, communications or their affiliations, et cetera. They're, to a certain extent, coming into work in a prison system, you waive a certain amount of your privacy rights, would seem to me.
Yes.
And you do so voluntarily. You know that you're going into a very dangerous, controlled environment, and you would, particularly as an employee or a chaplain, subject yourself to a heightened scrutiny.
Yes. All staff.
So what do you do to protect against potentially radical chaplains influencing inmates? I mean, what are you doing to make sure that you keep tabs on these guys so they're not, for example, affiliating themselves with, communicating with some of these radical nut jobs out there?
Well, any program services are delivered within our institution, as you've mentioned, there is no privacy in regards to carrying out your work and interactions with
And people
the inmate
understand that when they come
population.
in.
And staff, all staff understand that. And many of the services provided with the inmate population, they're monitored and recorded. So we do not have any large-scale concern throughout the agency where something is occurring. And if we are informed, as I've mentioned, through intelligence gathering, that there's a specific issue relative to any specific staff member, we will appropriately address those concerns and investigate properly.
Sure, and I won't drag it out, but I just want to close with saying we're not talking about just communication with inmates. I'm talking about these guys side of the prison system with some of these radical elements is just a real concern.
Yes, and I stated earlier, we work very, very closely with the law enforcement community, and if it is brought to our attention, whether it is a chaplain or any employee within the Bureau, and there is a concern that something is inappropriate, we will ensure that those issues are properly investigated and handled.
Has NSA ever brought anybody to your attention? Have you ever had one of the intelligence agencies of the United States point out, you've got a guy coming into the prison system as a chaplain or whatever, and this guy's he's been communicating with someone who's a real problem? Has that ever happened?
Well, Congressman, I would state, for the record, we work with the entire law enforcement community, and when we are engaged with any specifics for a specific agency, we address the concerns.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we've done a good hearing, and it's your last hearing, potentially in this capacity, and it's been a joy working with you through this process. You're the only committee chairman in the history of the House that doesn't use a clock of any sort at any time through these proceedings that allows every member of the committee to ask whatever questions they want. And I actually think that you should be publicly commended for that, because oftentimes members, particularly in junior positions in the committee, haven't had the same opportunity to ask questions. So thank you, and I yield back.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Fatah, for your comments.
I want to second that, truly, Mr. Chairman. No, really, you really let everybody have a chance to talk. It's really been, you've done a great service to the country and the people of Virginia.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cole. I just want to thank you. If you take it back, thank all of your staff, all the guards, and the people that don't get the opportunity to come home to Washington. We are very, very grateful for what they do. And with that, the hearing's adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Can I chat with Mr. Chairman?